Brian.
Obviously. Okay, I'm Yoram Unguru. I am on faculty at the Berman Institute, and it really is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Andy Shuman. Andy is a friend and a colleague, a collaborator, a kindred eating spicy chicken wing buddy. That was last night's dinner. Andy has a lot of titles and has accomplished quite a bit. He is an associate professor in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery at University of Michigan. And he also serves as the chief of the Clinical Ethics Service in the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine. Andy is really, truly a thought leader in ethical issues, both within the surgical ethics space as well as surgical oncology. He has broad interests and skills. His work is both in the clinical ethics space, normative ethics, empirical bioethics research, and he's published in all of these areas widely and in leading journals. He's funded at the national level through the NIH, the VA, societal grants, and has done really groundbreaking work. Andy has been a PI on projects that are focused on cancer treatment decision-making, precision oncology, and work that he and I have engaged in drug shortages. And he not only is an academic and a clinician, but Andy is one of those unique people whose work has been appreciated by policymakers. So he is a sought-after advisor. He's testified at the US Senate on the issue of drug shortages. And I could go on, but then we wouldn't leave Andy any time for his talk. So please join me in welcoming Andy Shuman.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Yoram has been a dear friend and collaborator of mine for over a decade, so I'll pay him back for the kind words. Everybody hear me okay? We good? Great. So we're going to talk about a topic today that never was my intent to be my area of focus. This was literally something that was much more reactionary initially and something that I hoped would be short-lived, but here we are a decade later, and you'll unfortunately see that this remains a very timely issue. I don't have any formal disclosures or conflicts other than that I do have some funding sources for the work that I'll be talking about, and also that I am a federal employee but not representing the federal government today. So this is a story of hurricanes, which is not necessarily how most bioethics seminars start. But as all of you know, there was a hurricane about a month ago that took out the Baxter facility that produces 60% of the IV fluids that are used in North America. So 60% of all IV fluids used in North America are made in one plant in North Carolina. You might say, how is that possible? How is there not diversity of supply? How are we not redundant? And over the next 45 minutes, I'll tell you why. But I'll also tell you that the hurricane that happened a week later almost took out the Braun facility that makes 20% of the IV fluids in the United States. So 90% of the IV fluids that are used in the United States and really continental, the entire North American continent, are in the line of fire of 2 hurricanes over the course of 2 weeks. What that meant was that the 1.2 million bags per day that are sent out of the Baxter facility literally had nowhere to go. The facility was underwater, the bridges to it were washed out, and we had absolutely no idea what was going to come or when. So IV fluids went on shortage with literally 0 notice overnight. And again, 2/3 of the hospitals in this country use the fluids from this facility. IV fluids are big and heavy and cheap. And those are all really hard things to deal with from a shortage standpoint. Our institution, Michigan Medicine, uses roughly 100,000 bags per month, conservative estimate. So you can imagine we can't keep months or years of supply just hanging around, right? The reason that this is made in one big facility is because it's really complicated to do. They also expire. meaning you can't keep a large backlog. They need to be temperature controlled because they're sterile. And by the way, they're also about 3 to 4 cents per bag. So the idea here is that very cheap, heavy, complex to synthesize, short-lived devices are not the kind of thing that the country can absorb a shortage of. Just so you don't accuse me of not having a timely talk, this was the email that we sent out this morning at Michigan Medicine on how we're handling the shortage. And today's decision was that we were essentially running out of lactated ringers bags, and we were advising how to mitigate that shortage. And that was sent this morning. You can see the timestamp at the top. So you can say I'm either really timely or I make my slides late. Either way, here you are. You might just say, well, it's a natural disaster. We can't anticipate these. We can't rely upon these. This can't happen that often, except it does. So this was the Pfizer facility that was taken out about 1.5 years ago by a tornado. And this one stockpiled about 50% of the propofol used in the United States. So 50% of the propofol was stored and synthesized in this facility. And you don't need to be a surgeon to know that propofol is really important because people should be asleep during surgery. And then you might say, well, gosh, 1 hurricane, 2 tornadoes. There's no way we could have anticipated this, except we can, because this is the road that went to the Baxter facility in Puerto Rico that made the entire nation's supply of IV mini bags, which sounds like a silly problem. A mini bag is basically a tiny little plastic bag full of 50 to 100 cc's of saline, but those obviously are really, really important when you're giving IV infusions, because that's the bag that pharmacists and nurses and techs mix in order to be able to give the life-saving drugs. And basically the entire nation's supply of these tiny little bags was made in one facility that was taken out by Hurricane Maria. There was a nice New England Journal article written about this, and this was in 2017-18, I believe, that said, gosh, how can we have all of our IV fluids made in one facility? And long story short, we didn't really learn. It's not just fluids that we're talking about. I'm a cancer doctor. This is a drug that has been known about for about 100 years. It's called cisplatin. It costs per vial less than what it costs to fill a tank of gas. It's about 50 to 60 bucks for a vial of this stuff. And it is one of the workhorses of cancer therapy for liquid tumors, solid tumors, number of different kinds of protocols from children to adults. This is one of the drugs that is really a linchpin of taking care of people with cancer. And there was a national shortage of this one just a few years ago as well. So my goal over the next little bit is to talk about drug shortages, why they happen and how they happen, what are the ethics of managing them, and then again, talking about ethics and frameworks is great, but unless we have pragmatic, practical solutions at the institutional, regional, and national level, I'm not doing a service. So my goal is to walk through what those might look like, both at your institutional level as well as at the federal level. So this is a major problem. Hopefully I've made that point already. And the bottom line is clinicians are not very good at rationing. We don't like it. We don't like being told we don't have enough of what we want to use. And we don't have the training or the support necessary to react to that in ways that are equitable, just, fair, measured, evidence-based, and so on. But the problem here is that neither I nor any of you can solve this problem because it is a federal one. This is a problem baked into a highly regulated system that has perverse incentives or disincentives to make the drugs that we actually need. And it is the cheap, generic, tried and true, evidence-based drugs that we're perennially running out of. It's not the fancy biologics. It's the non-sexy, old-school drugs that actually save lives. This is an ongoing problem. This is about 23 years of data published by ASHP, which is the major pharmaceutical think tank and professional organization. This is not the times a drug was on shortage. This is the number of drugs every year that we run out of perennially in the United States. So this is cisplatin, this is fluids, this is all of the other antibiotics that we've run out of over the course of a number of years. The only reason the 23 data are limited here is because I just pulled this from the June data. So that's just half the year's worth. So it's not actually like the trend is going in the right direction. It's actually going in the wrong direction. And this shows by quarter what that national trend looks like because they add up, right? It's not just one drug is short on any given day and then, oh, we're fine. These shortages last months or years, depending upon what we're talking about. And this will show that ebb and flow of, again, number of drugs short by every quarter of the last 10 years. If anything, these numbers underestimate the problem because these are only the shortages that are reported to FDA and or the ones that ASHP knows about. So we've looked at our own data at the institutional level, and this shows what Michigan medicine's shortages have been over the course of the last this is 2 years of data, and shows that actually at Michigan medicine, where we're really good at knowing what we have or don't have, we're reporting probably twice as many shortages as FDA and ASHP are reporting. So I'm in a public health school. I'm not a public health expert, and I'm certainly not an economist. But what I do know is that when you're dealing with companies that want to make profit, asking them to spend a ton of money to make a product that doesn't last very long, that is dirt cheap, and that has a short shelf life is not a winning combination, right? Nobody wants to make stuff that they're going to get pennies on the dollar for, that has a high degree of risk of contamination or problems, and that you can't keep a large supply of. And for all of those reasons, we are running out of the most important drugs. Put another way, in order to make IV fluids, as silly as that sounds, you need a couple $100 million to build a factory that can be sterile, that can make the product, that can synthesize the product, that can sterilize the bags, and get everything out. And what you might imagine is there's absolutely no reason to invest in a 9-figure building to make something that you're not going to make a significant profit on. What that also means is that the facilities where these are made, generally speaking, were built in the 1960s and 70s and are updated just enough to keep FDA out of out of the crosshairs of FDA. Right? So that's the reason why we ran out of propofol 5 years ago, because there was a massive fungal contamination of the factory, because it's really hard to make. And when you're using 1970s equipment, things happen. So generics, again, not an economist, one slide. The economists in the room will pick this apart, but it makes the point, right? When you lose profitability, there's not as many people making the drug, right? There's not as many people who are part of this production. So you have few people making it, or a few companies making it, in a few outdated facilities. And when, for example, there is a tornado or a hurricane or a fungal outbreak, the entire country is out of luck because we don't have a stockpile, we don't have redundancy, and we don't have the lead time to respond to it appropriately. So you might say, well, yeah, but are people actually getting hurt? Yes, they are. So this is one study showing how these shortages affect outcomes. So mechlorethamine is a drug that is basically nitrogen mustard. So this has been around forever, since World War I. And believe it or not, it's really good at killing lymphoma cells, especially when combined with 3 other drugs, and was part of the Pediatric Hodgkin's Consortium trial that showed that this was a really good treatment. What happened, though, was about 15 years ago, we had a shortage of this drug. So we replaced it with cyclophosphamide, which is a different drug that we thought, or at least the folks who are smarter than me in pediatric oncology thought would work just as well. This is a Kaplan-Meier curve, though, that shows, guess what? It doesn't work just as well. And in fact, the 3 to 5 year remission rates with one drug are massively different than when we use an inferior replacement, despite our best efforts. And what that means, reading these numbers, is that 40% of children who got this new regimen had a recurrence that required additional chemo or bone marrow transplant or death within 2 to 3 years. And that was, again, being done in a systematic way in the most evidence-sound methodology possible at the time. What we also know is that people die from preventable illness. So this is data. This isn't a very happy talk, sorry. So this is data showing that the drugs that we use to maintain people's blood pressures in the ICU really impact outcomes. And we have a ton of these drugs. So if you talk to any intensivist, they'll say, I have 16 different drugs that I could use to get your blood pressure up. But they're really comfortable using a select number of them. The nurses know how to mix them. They know how to titrate them. They know how to tweak them. And when one group of hospitals ran out of one of these drugs, for which there was a ton of redundancy, their survival rates went down in a significant way, especially compared to the hospitals that had a different supplier that didn't run out of that drug. So again, it's a real world experiment that shows that people die even when you run out of a drug that you have replacements for, because of errors, because of unfamiliarity, because of different workflow, and so on. That error is real, and part of it is an issue of handoffs, changes in strategy, changes in equipment. You can imagine what the IV fluid is doing to us right now when we run out of one bag. Yes, we have other options, but we don't know how to use it the same way, and it adds levels of complexity, and it adds multiple steps with a Swiss cheese model of error that leads to problems and people dying. We also know that trainees are really, really, really bad at making these adjustments, because who gets called at 3 a.m. when you don't have the bag of IV fluid? It's the intern who received zero training in knowing how to come up with a workaround or a different solution. And in fact, 19 out of 20 trainees said they had absolutely no training in how to do this, even though they're the ones who are going to get paged in the middle of the night to answer that question. It's also really, really expensive. So in 2004, which is a year that we actually have good data for, drug shortages increased just acquisition costs by $100 million. In 2019, that acquisition cost, conservatively measured, was $360 million. Acquisition cost, to me, is actually one of the smaller amounts of money that we're dealing with. But when we talk about labor, we're talking about way more money. So in 1 year, there were 9 million incremental hours spent by hospital staff purely to respond to drug shortages. 9 million incremental hours per year, underestimated. Michigan Medicine, my institution, has 3 full-time FTE purely dedicated to addressing and mitigating drug shortages. 3 people who their entire job is to keep our cabinet full. And individual hospital systems, conservatively speaking, are absorbing another $200 million on top of that. And as one example, when you don't have the right size IV bag, you have to use an infusion pump instead, which is a workaround that works. But guess what? We don't have enough infusion pumps. So our institution spent $1 million just to rent infusion pumps to deal with this response. So you can see how this adds up very, very, very quickly. Not to mention the massive non-financial impact of this, which is very real and very scary, which is talking to people and saying, I'm sorry, I don't have the chemotherapy drug that we discovered 100 years ago and proved 50 years ago is the best way to cure your cancer and costs less than a gallon of gas, but we ran out of it. How do you have that conversation with a patient, with a patient's parents, with your colleagues, with everybody else who's part of this system? And we also know that this is not a problem that only affects a few people. This is a problem that affects everybody in modern medicine today. So in one study in 2012, during the propofol, with the first propofol shortage that I know about, there was probably one before that, that was the fungal contamination one. 96% of anesthesiologists said that they had to change the way they put people to sleep for surgery because of that propofol shortage. And I remember that I was a surgical trainee. I was finishing my fellowship when literally patients were moving on the table because the anesthesiologist would say, sorry, I'm tweaking the drugs because I'm just not used to using this. Right? It doesn't get more real than that. Speaking about propofol, that secondary shortage happened in 2020 because the largest facility making propofol was in northern Italy in the spring of 2020. And you might recall that that was the second place where COVID hit strongest in March, February, March, April. and shut down that facility, which supplied a massive amount of the propofol around the country. Also talking about research, many of the research protocols require the drugs that are going on shortage. And what that means, in just 1 year, 23 multi-institutional cancer NCI designated trials were either paused or halted or fully canceled because we ran out of the drugs. Think about the opportunity cost of the hundreds of millions of dollars of NIH funding and support that went into those trials that we were unable to answer the question, let alone all of the participants who were a part of them. As one really ridiculous example, the state of Virginia ran out of a drug used to keep people from moving, a paralytic drug that we use in surgery all the time, because they stockpiled it because they were afraid they weren't going to get enough to execute prisoners. Right? One small instance, but a really, in my mind, jarring example of how this plays out. And that wasn't a national shortage. That wasn't on my FDA ASHP slide because that was a Virginia-specific issue. So we've been writing about this, talking about this, complaining about this for many years. This is a front page New York Times article from 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago. Sorry, math is hard. And our very own Dr. Unguru is quoted in that article. 2 kids in front of you with cancer, you have enough drug for one. Who gets it? Jimmy or Peter? Right? Who should be making that decision? We should not be forced to make that decision. As another particularly jarring example of this, talking about pediatric oncology, we had a drug shortage at our institution of one of the old school tried and true chemo drugs. And in fact, a specific pediatric cancer, neuroblastoma, was not prioritized for this drug because there were alternative drugs. Again, getting to my earlier slide, the alternatives don't always work as well. And what we did in that particular case, we had one kid with a rare tumor who did not meet our prioritization metric because we were trying to decide who should get it. And I'll get into those slides in a minute, but this kid didn't meet the criteria. But a heroic pharmacist literally sucked out the last drop of drug from 4 other vials that were going to other patients and cobbled together enough dose for this kid based on literally the last drop in 4 different vials that required coordinating all 4 of those patients to get their infusions on the same day so we could suck out the extra CC and send it to the children's hospital for that baby. Right? That baby's life should not be dependent upon whether or not the pharmacist can suck out the last drop. And literally that's what it came down to. We've also framed this as a national security threat, and I'll talk about the governmental response shortly. One of the reasons for this is because 80 to 90% of the drugs and the precursors to the drugs that we rely on in the United States come from abroad, mostly from India and China. And you don't need to be a politician to know that we should not be reliant upon other nations who may be adversarial to our nation for 80 to 90% of the drugs and their precursors that we use in this country. So this is indeed a national security issue. I don't need to tell you that shipping is potentially problematic. We also ran into a temporary shortage when the bridge went down a few miles from here because drugs were coming in and the port was closed. And as a result of that, things were shipped indirectly, which meant that there were shortages in specific markets related to shipping lanes. So supply chain is yet another component of the geopolitics that plays a role here. So what are we running out of? Just to put it in perspective, generally old school tried and true drugs, salt water, baking soda, antibiotics that have been around for 50 years, chemotherapy drugs that have been around for 40 years. That's what we're running out of. So why are we running out? As I said, quality control, outdated infrastructure, and supply line issues. Economic prioritization, right? People don't want to make salt water when they can make a biologic that they can charge 100 grand per dose for. And there's no early warning system, right? We don't know what we're going to run out of. We don't know where the next hurricane or tornado or God knows what is going to hit. Very rarely it's a dearth of raw materials. I can count on one hand the number of shortages that were actually because we ran out of a raw material. It does happen, but it's really rare. And this is one of the more jarring slides you'll see today. So what is the most common cause of a drug shortage in this country? And I'll point out, I'll call out Dr. Professor Levine in the front row because he is wearing glasses and is in the front row. What is the most common cause of shortages in this country?
It looks like unknown would not provide.
Right. Unknown would not provide is the most common cause for shortages. What does that mean? It means that companies that are publicly traded don't necessarily want to tell you when their factory has a fungal outbreak. And unless FDA forces them to tell them, they're not going to. So what this means is we literally don't know while we're running out of most of the drugs in this country because there's absolutely no incentive or regulatory body that can enforce sharing that information with the government or publicly. Again, talking about shortages, it's not just about drugs. We run out of blood, we run out of fluids, we run out of organs, we run out of a whole lot of different things, and we ration them using the dirty R word, which I'll get to in a few slides, but I'm focusing more on drugs here today just based on scope. So again, this is an audience that doesn't need to see this slide. I think of principalism as a very nice way of describing these problems, not of solving them, right? Everybody wants to be able to exercise their autonomy to request the drug of preference or that is being recommended. All clinicians in this case want to maximize benefit and do good and help people. We all want to avoid inadvertently killing somebody because we give them an inferior alternative or because we don't know how to mix the right kind of blood pressure medication in the ICU. And we want to be fair, we want to be just, we want to be equitable. But the problem is drug shortages create situations where these principles are directly in conflict, and no principles-based approach, at least in my opinion, is going to solve this problem, even if it's a really good way to describe it. Largely what this comes down to is individual versus public health ethics, the idea that when we're taking care of individual patients, it is very different than taking care of populations of patients across an institution, across a city, across a state, across a nation. So that brings us to the R word. Well, sorry, that was loud. That brings us to the R word, which some folks think of as a dirty word, but we do this all the time, right? We ration every day in very different ways, most of the time without even thinking about it, right? Distributive justice is the concept here. How do you slice up a pizza when everybody's hungry? Do you give 8 slices to the hungriest people? Do you cut it into 24 tiny little slices where nobody's happy? Or do you know that Ungur just played tennis and he needs the whole pizza, right? How do you decide who gets unfair amounts of resource-limited resources? What do? We do the best that we can in different ways, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But when I have a patient in front of me, I will do everything I possibly can for that patient. And another way of framing this is that you can't ration in a way that pits individual patients against each other and you make the doctor or the nurse or anyone else the linchpin, because I will always do everything in my power to help the individual patient in front of me. But when I'm charged with taking care of all of the patients at Michigan Medicine or the state of Michigan or the nation, the way that we ration and the way that we divide up the pie is fundamentally going to look different, because I have to look out for the interest of all in a way that transcends that dyad between me as a cancer surgeon and my patient, who I will literally cross bridges to try to help, but it's different when we're talking about populations. So there's a lot of different ways of rationing. Often we've rationed by default in this country. We ration based on who can show up at the door, right? Who can show up at the door? Generally the privileged, wealthy, white-collar individual who drives a Maserati. That's who shows up first, and that's who gets the care. The people who have insurance, the people who have the resources, the people who have the education. It's different, obviously, that is unequitable, that is unfair, we need to fix that. This talk is not about fixing that, that's a larger talk. But what we can talk about is when we're rationing finite supplies like drugs, we need to have formal criteria, we need to think about stakeholders, we need to think about the fact that the next shipment may show up next week or next year, and we have to have a rationing schema that can respond to either. And we also cannot rely on individual clinician judgment for the reasons that I just stated. So what that means is we need systems that are evidence-based, recognizing that data are imperfect, but it's better than nothing. They need to be transparent, meaning that everybody knows what we're doing and why. They need to be universal, meaning no special people, right? I don't care whether you donated and your name is on the building, or whether you are uninsured and showed up in the ER, right? Same criteria apply to everybody. And they need to be objective. It can't be based on societal worth. It can't be based on, well, I think this guy's going to do better. It needs to be based on the best evidence we have that we get to via consensus. That sounds great, but it's way, way, way messier than that. More often than not, we don't know whether cyclophosphamide or mechlorethamine is going to work better, right? We don't have that data. We don't know whether cisplatin is a bigger benefit for gynecologic oncology patients versus head and neck cancer patients. Nobody's going to do that study. We have no idea. We don't know how to measure most benefit. Is that quality adjusted life years? Is that likelihood of achieving a remission? Is that ease of administration? And so on and so on. Should age be an independent variable? Do we think about age in a binary way? Do we save the kids first? Do we save the older folks first? Does my 90-year-old who still works a full-time job get considered differently than my 50-year-old? First come, first serve sounds great as a default system, right? Well, if we can't decide, then whoever shows up first gets it. Who shows up first? The rich guy in the Maserati, right? Not the blue-collar worker who needs to take the bus. The supply increase and decrease issue is really germane to this. Baxter called our institution and said, we expect that you're going to get 60% of your allocation of IV fluids next week, 80% by Thanksgiving, and 90% by the end of December. But we also just got a call saying, just kidding, you're going to get 40% of the lactated ringers. And you're going to get 30% of the 250 cc bottles. So how do I come up with a rationing schema that recognizes that a lot of this happens on a whim? And finally, do we prioritize subjects and participants in research? We've just come from the LACS groundbreaking. We know how important research is. We also know how vulnerable research populations and subjects are. But do we think about someone on a research protocol fundamentally differently when we're deciding who gets the cisplatin versus someone who's not on a research protocol? Are we creating an undue coercive model to tell people they need to be on research in order to get the drug that we've had for the last 50 years? Is that fair or is that just? And how do we think about their inherent vulnerability as a research subject or participant vis-a-vis a normal quote-unquote patient? Putting this into the perspective of IV fluids, it gets even more complicated, right? How do you decide who's more worthy of getting salt water, right? That's a ridiculous question to ask, but it's the one that we're literally answering on a day-to-day basis right now. So Dr. Rozoff from Duke put out a nice paper about 15 years ago talking about how to do this, right? You need a transparent process. You need all the right stakeholders in the room. You need to be able to enforce it appropriately. You need to be able to ask questions and second guess yourself, and you need it to be fair. All of these are true. But it's really complicated to get a phone call saying, Baxter isn't sending you IV fluids next week. We need to decide who gets IV fluids tomorrow, right? How do you get all of those people in the room to talk about that on zero notice? So you need ethics committee members, you need pharmacy leadership, you need all the clinicians who are impacted, which is, again, how do you decide which clinician should be in the room when you're talking about IV fluids? A therapeutics and P&T committee is there. You definitely want your senior administrative leaders to be aware, if not there. You definitely want risk management and legal to be a part of it. You need communications. You need all of these different rungs of a ladder to meet very quickly to do this right. As one early example of what Duke did, and I think it is a prescient one, so there was a shortage of preservative-free methotrexate, which is a very niche drug that's used for a specific kind of cancer or a couple of different kinds of cancer, and also for autoimmune conditions. And in this particular case, the decision was we're only going to give it to a select group of cancer patients and not to other individuals. But having a pharmacist in the room was really important because this is a weight-based drug. And what they said is, hold on, what we're doing is going to work, but if we don't round down, we're going to waste bags. So what we're going to do is calculate the weight-based dose, but round it down to the lowest 50 milligrams, because then we don't need to waste the extra bag. And after that, there was an entire set of research being done to say, how much is it safe to round down to? And as you might expect, that research wasn't able to give a clear answer. So we generally round down about 10% without any knowledge of whether or not that's appropriate. But that's what we're doing because that's what we have to do. Talking about IV fluids, this is a screenshot. It's low resolution because it's literally from the email that we sent out today on what we're doing and where we are. So we have a phased approach to IV fluid management right now at Michigan Medicine. And again, this is not just us. This is roughly 2/3 of the hospitals in this country are dealing with this right now. We have a 3-phased approach. Phase 1 is to conserve supply. Don't waste stuff, right? Like broadly speaking, it's the don't waste stuff approach. And what don't waste stuff means is we're not spiking bags before people show up. We're not hanging fluids if someone can drink some water. If someone's on a regular diet, they don't need maintenance IV fluids running, like basic silly things. We're into early phase 2, where we're limiting care in ways that don't violate standards of care, but definitely that make things more miserable. And as examples of what phase 2 looks like, we've postponed a certain number of urologic surgeries that require constant irrigation of the bladder because they burn so much fluid. So these procedures, again, without getting too technical, involve a scope that needs to flush constantly while you're doing this procedure, but you're flushing with sterile saline or water. So you're using somewhere on the order of 10 bags, 10 3-liter bags of fluid in order to do this operation. What we found out was there's a specific kind of urologic surgery that uses tons of these bags, and we could actually just stop those procedures temporarily and solve that particular problem without influencing everybody who needs urologic surgery and arthroscopic orthopedic surgery as well, which also use those bags, because there's one specific surgery that uses 10 times more than everybody else. The next question, though, was from a utilitarian standpoint, is that the right answer? Or are we inadvertently creating a disparity? For example, is that the procedure that is more common in a certain population of patients, right? Based on race, based on diagnosis, based on age, and making sure we're not inadvertently creating a disparity by a very well-meaning distribution plan. In fact, we weren't, and we also recognize that there's only two surgeons who do that operation, who are basically going to have their operative practice stopped temporarily because of this. And essentially what we decided was that wasn't our priority, was being fair to all of the surgeons, but rather to the patients. And as a result, those procedures are not happening during this month because we just don't have enough bags. As another example of the IV fluid decisions, we are thinking about how it is not a violation of the standard of care to use the gut, so to speak, and let people drink or put it in an NG tube rather than hang a bag of fluid, especially the little bags that we're running out of. Guess who's influenced by that, though, is kids who are dehydrated and show up in the ER. So what that means is that children who show up in the ER, instead of getting an IV to get rehydrated, are having an NG put in and having a bag of water dumped into their bellies. Doesn't violate the standard of care, but you tell that to the nurse and the mom at the bedside of a screaming kid with a tube in their nose because we don't have the bag of fluid to give them, right? That's what phase 2 looks like. And then obviously phase 3 gets really ugly when we're rationing with a capital R. And I hope and pray we won't get there. And if Baxter is right about when they're going to be back online, we'll avoid phase 3 and we'll stay in that very light key lime green phase that we're treading water in right now. Also recognizing the marketplace is inherently unfair. 1/3 of hospitals in this country get their IV fluids through a joint supply contract through a different facility, the one that almost got hit by the second hurricane but didn't. What that means is 1/3 of the hospitals in this country have absolutely no impact whatsoever. They have as much IV fluids as they need. And literally one of those is across the road from us. They're fine. You might say, well, gosh, can't they just send you some fluid? Kind of, but it's complicated because there's regulatory rules about the fact that they can't sell it to us They have to just give it to us based on Medicare rules and CMS rules. We can't do the quality assurance that we normally do with our suppliers because we don't know if it was sitting in their unheated warehouse or not. Obviously, we trust them, but there are rules and there's regulatory components of this. Again, it gets very complicated very quickly. Another thing that happened on the federal side is we brought in an emergency importation of Baxter fluid from international suppliers that are not FDA approved. And FDA essentially said you can do this in an emergency. But those literally, you can't fly them because it's too heavy. So they're on a ship coming across the Atlantic where, oh, by the way, they ran into another hurricane that was hitting the Azores. And they needed to make a roundabout pass around that. You can't make this up, right? That was coming into, you guessed it, the port of Baltimore to avoid the bridge and be distributed across the country. So like, it's almost like it's a fake out in terms of me trying to make this as complicated as possible. But all of these things are coalescing in why little kids are having a tube shoved in their nose when they otherwise can get an IV. There's also a lack of coordination. We don't know what our neighbors are doing. It's very complicated and tricky, especially with certain drug shortages, to understand what rationing protocols are being used at other facilities and hospitals. So this brings me to the last phase of this presentation, which is on policy responses. I've never thought of myself as a policy guy. That was never my focus. But I've quickly learned that in order to engender change in this space, we need to be able to talk policy, influence policy, talk to the stakeholders who are writing and influencing policy. Because frankly, federal law is the only way this is going to change. We've made baby steps of progress. So under Obama, FACS, which is an FDA act from 2012, gave us some very basic tools to fix this. One is that at least drug manufacturers now have to tell us when they're running out of something. They didn't even need to tell us, being FDA or the country, when they were running out of a drug prior to 2012. Now they have to tell us that they're running out. Based on the blue pie chart that I showed you earlier, what don't they have to tell us? Why? Right. So that's the next law we'd like to get passed. We also have a situation now where at least FDA can emergency import product, like we just did from Baxter. That didn't exist before FACS, or certainly not in the robust form that it exists today. So at least Commissioner Califf can sign a piece of paper that allows Baxter to send their Irish fluid supply. For whatever reason, they're big factories in Ireland. And that's the act. Another way of dealing with this is recognizing that we have essential drugs that we need. Every country should have a list of what you need to keep in the cupboard. Why? A couple reasons. Number one, so you know what you really need. And number two, so that you can incentivize companies to make the products that everyone globally recognizes are the critical necessities for any pharmacy in your nation. WHO has a list of these. They're more for the developing world than they are for us, but they still apply. And the things that are focused upon are things that are cheap, things that don't need to be put in a refrigerator, things that have multiple indications, things that have a long shelf life, right? Not necessarily the best drug, but the one that can help the most people for the longest time and can sit in an unrefrigerated, unheated closet for as long as you need it. And we have that list, and it's been updated every 2 years since 1977. Michigan, or not Michigan, the United States does not have a similar list for the country. And I would argue that we need one because our needs are a little bit different than the ones that WHO recognizes. There's other approaches to this, and Yoram and I wrote a paper on this. I think this paper is about 6 or 7 years old, talking about how there's a European Union model that actually incentivizes pricing and production based on value, which is a foreign concept in the United States. That actually what something is worth and how valuable it is should influence what it costs. And again, that is not a perfect system, and you could look up HSI to see why it's not a perfect system, but at least it's a rational step in that right direction. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this. One is to create a scoring system where we actually know whether a product is being made in a factory that is been updated since 1968. And there's absolutely no way in FDA's world of giving anything a grade. FDA is pass fail. And I don't need to tell the educators in the room that pass fail is not really the best way to assess quality. So if you have a product, FDA will either allow you to sell it or not. There's absolutely no distinction between something coming from a tenuous factory with water dripping down versus a new beautiful facility that was just built or just maintained. So one thing that me and many others have talked about is if FDA will allow companies to have some kind of a scoring system, it will allow hospitals to spend a little bit more money to buy a product coming from a company that is more reliable in terms of supply as well as quality. That would be a relatively simple change to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act that would make a massive difference, and we hope we'll actually be able to get through. Another way to think about the role of government is just like the lights in this room are on because of a public-private partnership, we can recognize that there's nothing wrong with government working with pharma and industry to prioritize the things that are of value. We have public-private partnerships for our energy grid and our water maintenance and many other critical infrastructure components of this government and our lives. I would argue that drugs are one of them. There's ways of doing that are creative, right? You don't necessarily have to create or build a system that is too complicated. There's ways of doing this in a relatively simple way. For example, we can provide money as a government to companies to build a factory and basically say, we will give you money to build a factory if you're going to make salt water in that factory, right? We'll help offset some of that initial cost so that you can make the product that we actually need, that otherwise you're not going to get a lot of money for. These products and problems are not novel. We've been talking about them and writing about them for years. So this is the drug shortage report from FDA from 2018-19 that talked about the root causes and potential solutions. As you might imagine, COVID made all of these things worse and compounded the problem, but it certainly didn't create it. And then the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee of the US Senate put out two reports, one in 2020 and another in 2023, talking about these problems and potential solutions. Another interesting component of the politics of this is that if you frame this as an issue of national security, it can get bipartisan support, right? The Dems and the Republicans are both very happy to say that the United States should not rely upon China for our drugs and that perhaps we should build them in America. As a result of that, some of the bipartisan legislation that's been proposed focuses on bringing production back to the United States, solidifying the supply chain, working with manufacturers on ways of ensuring quality and product to exist here in the US specifically. There's a really nice report from the Hamilton Project, which is from the Brookings Institute, that talks about how to combine push and pull incentives to improve infrastructure. One of the other tricks here is that we can't just give tax breaks or give blank checks to pharma, not necessarily because that's a bad thing, which you can have a separate conversation about, but because it's a political non-starter for the Democrats, frankly, in order to be able to support this, right? So it has to be done in ways that are fiscally sound and responsible, but also don't look as if industry is just giving a blank check or getting a blank check from the government. Also, we can have buffer inventories. We can create stockpiles of some things, whether that's cisplatin or any other product that we've run out of. And there's a number of bills that are proposed right now, some that are focusing on actually looking at expiration dating and how we can incentivize companies to make their expiration dates last longer, just like you sniff the milk in your fridge and drink it, even if it expired yesterday. Maybe we can do something a little bit more sophisticated, but similar with drugs. Also looking at our supply chain and really empowering FDA to do a better job of maintaining our supply chain. And also things like incentivizing bringing in product from abroad. So this was how we responded to that cisplatin shortage about 3 years ago. We also have some statewide efforts, and one of the research aims that I focused on was using a statewide approach to think about how stakeholders across different hospitals within the same state can recognize the shared responsibility to respond to shortages and share information, share patients, share supply, depending upon the setting, in a way that allow us to really crowdsource a little bit when it comes to responding to shortages, especially when there are haves and have-nots. Another novel approach is with this non-for-profit that started within Michigan that I'm proud to be a part of, that focusing on removing barriers to medication access. One of this is sharing information about the products that we're losing and using, depending on where it's coming from. And another part of this sounds simple, but when someone dies and they've been receiving a drug, what happens to all the drug that's left over? Where does it go? And this YesRx non-for-profit creates a way of getting that drug back in order to put it back into the market. That sounds really simple. It's actually really complicated from a logistical and regulatory standpoint, but is something that is a nice step in the right direction. So in short, drug shortages are a huge problem. We will continue to run out of salt water and chemotherapy drugs and many other things that we rely upon. We need to anticipate and mitigate, but really we need to go upstream and fix this problem with federal action. We need to ration in ways that are fair and equitable, recognizing that's a very easy thing to say, but a very hard thing to do. We need to build the infrastructure and knowledge among our clinicians and our leaders to respond to this adroitly. And frankly, we need to work with our elected leaders to engender the change that actually could fix this problem in a meaningful way. I think I've left a little time for comments and questions. I thank you for your attention, and the floor is open.
That was a great talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could sort of talk more about the kind of like possibility for sort of federal action. Because it occurs to me that I guess I want to sort of know like, why wasn't some of this stuff part of like Build Back Better? Or maybe it was, and of course that didn't ultimately come to pass, but I mean, everything you said about sort of the national security framing seems totally spot on, and we've done so much like as a result of that framing in other areas of the economy and the supply chain over the past few years during the Biden administration. So could you say a little bit more about sort of like why hasn't this been part of it?
So some small incremental change has. So for example, Omnibus had some of the things that I just talked about. So there are some things have snuck through, and a few of these bills are now law. Part of the challenge here, and the best reference for this is, sorry to make you dizzy going through the slides, is this Hamilton project that talks about how unless we do this in a cohesive way with one big bill that actually solves the problem, the piecemeal effect is not going to work. And one of the challenges is, by my count, there's 30 bills that mention or reference drug shortages that are stuck in committee in the House and the Senate right now. And they're all incremental Band-Aids or patches that, yes, will move the needle, but we really need a sea change and one big bill to fix it. So frankly, it's a matter of political will and wherewithal. Almost all of these are bipartisan, so it's not as if this can't be done, but the stagnation in Congress is really the biggest issue here.
Thanks for that. Is this on? Testing, yes. I'm appropriately horrified, so good job. So you sort of like lay out some of these big federal, like to solve the problem, we would have to do this. And then you talk a lot about what are some of the things that we kind of do that are a little bit more like tinkering around the edges. And so I guess I have a question about one of the tinkerings. You mentioned, expiration dates, and we smelled milk, and if it smells fine, you taste it, and it tastes fine, then we just swig away. And, part of me is like, I have suspicion that like my yogurt can last like 2 weeks past the expiration date, and that they really just want us to like buy more yogurt, right? Like, I don't know if this is evidence-based at all, the expiration dates. So one of my questions is, are the expiration dates on meds evidence-based at all? Like, could we actually find out that we could just keep a lot of this stuff like 6 months or a year longer? But the people who want to make money would obviously rather have us buy more often. So do we have any of that sort of information?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right, like these kinds of incremental changes are kind of like, moving deck chairs on the Titanic to some degree, but they will help. The short answer is the way that drug expiration dates are determined is because the company tests their efficacy at a certain length of time, and that's the date that gets stamped on it, right? So they have tested this drug for 5 years, and for 5 years it's good. As you might imagine, you don't need to be an economist or a business guru to realize that the shorter the expiration date is, the more money you make. And there's zero incentive for these companies to do the testing to extend an expiration date in a way that is going to sell less product. There are 2 bills on the floor right now. One came out of Slotkin's group that I helped with in Michigan that is specifically focused on a pilot project to do this differently. The other challenge is you can't just sniff the pill box to see if it still works, not only because we don't know, but also because it's illegal, right? So FDA law regulates whether or not you can use products after expiration dates or not, and without their literal stamp of approval, you're breaking the law.
Great talk, Andy. Amazing overview, thank you. To that point, we published years ago in one of our frameworks for how to approach these drug shortages using extended shelf life. Again, I will put the half and half in my coffee 2 days after it expired. And it's not that it doesn't work, it just doesn't work as well. Now Andy's spot on, it's illegal to do that. So ethically, one of the things that we need to do is have these discussions with our patients. But from a risk management perspective, your hospital council has to be willing to support you. It's one thing if the family, if the patient agrees to do that, but the hospital has a very different consideration. And so there's nothing magical that happens about this. So we certainly need to, because that's low-hanging fruit. Of course, it depends. If you're talking about a life-saving drug because you have sepsis and you're dying and it needs to be fully effective, is one thing versus you're taking acetaminophen for your headache. And if it's 90% effective, it's still probably going to work.
Thank you. This is a really interesting talk. I had a question about, you said you've been working on this for about a decade. So I'm just curious if you've come across frameworks from other countries about rationing, drugs and medical products. And I'm particularly thinking of like maybe India because they have a robust manufacturing and infrastructure, and they have a private and public system that, I'm sure they probably ration in different ways. I don't know. So I'm just curious if you come across other frameworks from other countries.
Yes, it's a great question. And this is a global problem in many ways, but it's exacerbated in the United States because of the ridiculous way that we price and regulate drugs, right? So the fact that generics are so cheap here, in fact, there's this, it's often called the race to the bottom, which is the cheaper you price your generics, the more likely you are to sell them. And that creates this disincentive, which doesn't exist in other places. India is a great example where they can just ramp up production very, very, very quickly. And in fact, there are a couple of Indian companies that have focused specifically on producing drugs in shortage and very deliberately have said, we're not exporting them, right? These are for us. And there, the opportunity cost of building a new factory is fundamentally different than what it takes to have an FDA-approved facility in the United States. So that's part of it. The EU is a great example of doing this better, although even there it's imperfect because there's very specific rules at the EU level, but then every member nation has its own set of rules that perhaps are more or less restrictive than what the EU broadly does. So it's even more complicated in some ways there. Think of it almost as federal versus state here in terms of the way laws are patched together. The scarier thing is that the vast majority of the developing world, using that not meant to be as pejorative as it sounds, has absolutely no data or guideline or framework of any sort. And in fact, most of the shortages are being rationed or apportioned or decided upon ad hoc at the bedside by people with absolutely no training or experience, even if they're well-meaning. So actually, the more terrifying thing for me is the fact that many of the rationing decisions that are being made are being done by terrified clinicians who don't know what to do and are just trying to do the best they can with no guidance whatsoever in the vast majority of the world.
Yeah, do we have time? Yeah, okay. Well, I was gonna ask about the buffer and what are the challenges around that? Why not peak freeze sailing or something, right? But I was also curious with your VA affiliation, is this the same experience in the VA system or is it very different for VAs?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question, so yes, a national stockpile of critical drugs is something that does exist, but needs to be massively beefed up, frankly. And a couple of the bills that I talked about would do just that. And that's a key part of the Hamilton Project's directive as well. So yes, it exists. It needs to be bigger and better. And there's ways of doing that. The question of the VA, for better or for worse, it's just as bad there. And I am in the exact same meetings at the VA as I am at the university here, deciding who gets what and when and why because of all of the things that we talked about. The suppliers are the same, right? They use the same suppliers to the large extent. One interesting problem there is there's increased levels of scrutiny on foreign product coming into VA. So for example, if Baxter's sending Irish fluids to the state of Michigan, it's going to be more complicated for them to get approved to be used at the VA than it would at a non-government facility. But in short, same problems.
Yeah, that would seem to add more fuel to your national security argument.
100% agree.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but please join me in thanking Andrew Shuman for a great talk.